"Don't open that laptop," she whispered. "Whatever you think you saw, you didn't, and whatever you do, don't let him know you're awake." I almost laughed. The flight attendant was maybe 23, her hair pulled back in a tight chignon, her Air Canada scarf slightly crooked. She didn't look like someone who delivered warnings. She looked like someone who asked if you wanted ginger ale or sparkling water. But her eyes were dead serious. I'd been dozing off somewhere over Ontario, my husband's shoulder warm against mine, the hum of the plane steady underneath us. We were headed to Vancouver for what he'd called our reset trip. 4 days. A rented cabin near Tofino. No laptops, no phones, just us. His words, his idea. His laptop, currently open on his tray table, screen tilted just enough that I'd caught a glimpse of something before I pretended to fall back asleep. His name is my husband, and until that flight, I believed he was a good man. My name is Nadia Leclerc. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed paralegal with Whitmore and Associates in Ottawa, which means I spend my days reading fine print other people miss. I know what a fraud clause looks like. I know what a signature transfer form looks like. I know, better than most, what it looks like when someone is moving money they have no right to move. What I saw on his screen looked like all three. I kept my eyes closed. My breathing stayed slow, deliberate. He shifted beside me, tapped something on the keyboard. I heard the soft click of keys and felt the particular stillness of someone trying not to wake you. The flight attendant passed again and her eyes met mine for half a second. She gave the smallest possible nod toward the galley at the back. I waited 3 minutes, then I unbuckled my seatbelt, touched my husband's arm lightly, murmured something about needing the washroom, and walked to the back of the plane. She was waiting near the coffee cart, arms crossed, voice low. "I recognized the name on his screen," she said. The company. Kessler Vance Capital. My uncle lost his retirement savings to them 2 years ago. They folded 6 months after taking his money. It was in the news. CBC did a piece on it. I stared at her. "I'm sorry about your uncle," I said. "But why are you telling me?" "Because the form he was filling out had your name on it," she said. "And you weren't filling it out." I went back to my seat. I didn't say a word. My husband had closed the laptop by the time I returned. He smiled at me. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Just tired." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, the way he used to do when we were first together, when I thought that gesture meant something. I let him. I rested my head back and closed my eyes and tried to remember everything I'd seen in those 2 seconds before I'd pretended to fall asleep again. Kessler Vance Capital. My name. A routing number. And a figure that looked very much like the amount currently sitting in my personal TFSA. We'd been married for 4 years. I'd kept that account separate. He knew it existed, but I'd been clear from the beginning that it was mine. Money I'd saved before we met, topped up every year since, earmarked for nothing in particular except the future. $42,000. Not a fortune, but an was. It's a down payment. It's a year of breathing room. It's the kind of money you don't give to a company that the CBC has already flagged as predatory. I did not sleep for the rest of that flight. Here is what I knew about my husband by the time we landed in Vancouver. I knew he'd been between contracts for 7 months, which was normal for someone in his field. He was a freelance UX consultant, but longer than usual. I knew he'd been more attentive lately, more romantic, more interested in doing things together. I'd thought that was us finding our footing again after a rough year. I know now that attentiveness has 2 flavors, and I'd confused one for the other. I knew he'd suggested this trip 3 weeks ago, very specifically, very suddenly. He'd even offered to handle the booking, and he'd asked me once, casually, over pasta, whether I'd ever thought about consolidating our savings into a joint investment account. I'd said no. He'd nodded and changed the subject, and I'd completely forgotten about it until that moment in seat 24A over Lake Superior. We took a cab to the hotel. He talked about the drive to Tofino the next morning, about a restaurant someone at his office had recommended, About the weather on the coast. I answered everything. I laughed when he said something funny. I was very, very calm. That night, when he fell asleep, I opened my phone. Kessler Vance Capital. CBC article, March 2023. 14 investors. Losses totaling 1.2 million. Principals under investigation by the Ontario Securities Commission. One name appeared repeatedly in the comment section of a Reddit thread about the case. Someone who'd done deep research on the company structure, who'd traced shell accounts back to a numbered corporation registered in Alberta. I read through every comment, and then I found a follow-up post from the same user, dated 8 months later, saying that one of the principals had resurfaced under a new corporate name. A name I didn't recognize, but there was a linked profile, and in that profile was a photo. And in that photo was my husband at some kind of event, arm around a man I'd never seen before, both of them smiling. The caption said, "Great evening with old friends. Old friends." I sat with that for a long time. I am a paralegal. I spend 8 hours a day thinking about paper trails and documentation and what constitutes sufficient evidence. So I did not panic. I opened my notes app, and I started writing down everything I remembered from the laptop screen. The form layout, the partial routing number, the name of the account, the figure. I wrote it all down. Then I opened my email and sent a message to my colleague back in Ottawa, a woman I trusted completely, the kind of person who shows up to things and doesn't ask why. "I need you to run a search on Kessler Vance Capital," I wrote, "and a related entity." I gave her the new corporate name from the Reddit thread. "Also pull anything on record for a numbered Alberta Corp that surfaces in connection with either of those names. I'll explain when I'm back. Don't mention this to anyone." She replied at 7:43 a.m. Ottawa time. She always starts early. On it. "You okay?" I typed. "Working on it." The next 2 days were the strangest of my life. We drove to Tofino. We walked on the beach at Long Beach in the rain, which is the only way to walk on that beach, really. And I will say this. The Pacific in November is a particular kind of beautiful that stays with you. We ate fish and chips in a little place on the main strip. He held my hand across the table. I let him. I was gathering information. I asked questions I already had answers to, just to see what he'd say. "How's the consulting work going?" "Oh, picking up," he said. "A few good leads." "When did you last talk to your business partner?" "He doesn't have a business partner, he's solo." But I wanted to see what he'd do with the question. He said, "What do you mean? I don't have a partner." I said, "Right, of course, I forgot." He gave me a slightly odd look and changed the subject. That night, he brought up the investment account again, this time with a name attached. He said he'd been talking to a financial advisor, a guy he'd met through a contact, really sharp, and he thought we should sit down with him when we got back to Ottawa. Get serious about our future. Maybe consolidate some things. I said, "That sounds really smart. Maybe I could bring my TFSA into it." He said, "Exactly, yeah. Exactly that." His face. In that moment, I recognized it. Not because I'd seen it before, but because I knew what it wasn't. It wasn't love. It wasn't excitement about our future. It was relief. The particular relief of a person who thinks a difficult thing just got easy. I went to bed early that night. In the bathroom, I checked my email. My colleague had come through. She always does. The numbered Alberta corporation connected to Kessler Vance Capital had been flagged by FinTrack in 2022 for suspicious transaction patterns. The new entity my husband's friend was running had 2 directors listed. One was the man from the photo. The other was a numbered holding company registered to an address in Canada. My husband's home office is in Canada. His business has a Canada address. I sat on the edge of the bathtub for a while. The kind of sitting where you're not really sitting, you're more like being held in place by the fact that your legs stopped working. Then I stood up, washed my face, and thought very clearly about what I was going to do next. We flew home 2 days later. He was in a good mood the whole flight. I was too, or I appeared to be, which is close enough. He talked about booking the financial meeting for the following week. I said, "Great, let's do Thursday." He said, "Perfect." I did not wait until Thursday. The Monday morning after we landed, I called my direct supervisor at Whitmore and Associates. Not as an employee, but as a client. I told her I needed 20 minutes and a closed door. She knew from my voice that this wasn't a routine thing. She cleared her calendar. I laid out everything: the laptop screen, the flight attendant, the CBC article, the Reddit thread, the photo, the Alberta registration, my colleague's research, the Canada address. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been carrying this for 4 days." "Yes." She said, "Okay, here's what we do." What we did was this. First, I called my bank and placed a freeze on any outgoing transfers from my TFSA pending secondary verification, meaning nothing could leave that account without a phone call to me directly, regardless of what authorization forms were on file. The bank flagged it as a precautionary hold and noted my concern without requiring a full explanation. This took 11 minutes. Second, my supervisor contacted a colleague in the securities division who had experience filing complaints with the OSC. We drafted a preliminary disclosure based on the connection between the numbered Alberta Corp and my husband's Canada address, and submitted it with the existing FinTrack flag as supporting context. Third, I called a family lawyer. Not because I wanted a divorce, not yet. I hadn't decided what I wanted, but because I needed to understand exactly where I stood, legally, financially, and in terms of documentation. She was kind and very precise, and she told me things I needed to hear in the order I needed to hear them. The Thursday meeting happened. I agreed to it. I sat across from my husband and his financial advisor, the man from the photo, closer up this time, with the particular confidence of someone who's done this before, and I listened to their pitch. It was polished. It referenced GIC rates and market volatility, and the benefit of pooling assets in a managed vehicle. He had a brochure. It looked real. I asked questions, careful, specific questions. What is the regulatory body overseeing this fund? What's the EMER? Where are the assets custodied? Is this registered with the OSC? The advisor's expression shifted by degrees, small enough that my husband didn't notice. But I did. He was recalibrating, deciding whether I was genuinely curious or whether I knew something. I let him wonder. I need to review this with my own financial counsel before signing anything. Standard practice for me. I work in law, you understand. I smiled at both of them. My husband's jaw tightened by a fraction. That evening, he was quiet over dinner. He said, "You don't have to make everything so complicated." I said, "I just want opportunity, Nadia." I said, "I know. I just need a few days." He said, "The offer might not be on the table in a few days." There it was. I looked at him across the dinner table. Really looked at him. Not at the version of him I'd built in my head over 4 years of marriage, but at the actual person sitting in front of me, who had apparently been connected to a fraudulent investment scheme, who had tried to move money out of my personal account without my knowledge, and who was currently using artificial urgency to pressure me into signing something that what he'd started on that plane over Ontario. I said, "Okay, I'll sign tomorrow." His shoulders came down. Hook set. I heard him on his phone in the kitchen, voice low. That specific low of someone trying not to be overheard. I caught 2 words. "She's ready." He was not talking to me. He got ready, told me the meeting was at 10, gave me a kiss at the door, said he'd send me the address. I said, "Perfect. See you there." He left. I did not go to a law office on Bank Street at 10 a.m. What I did was walk into a conference room at the OSC's Ottawa satellite office, where my supervisor, our securities contact, and an investigator who had been briefed over the preceding 72 hours were waiting with printed documentation, my digital notes, my colleague's research, and a recorded version of the Thursday pitch meeting, recorded legally, with the knowledge and assistance of my lawyer, under Ontario's one-party consent rules. My husband and his associate arrived at their address expecting me. What they found instead was a regulatory hold order on the investment entity, delivered by a compliance officer who had been coordinating with FinTrack since Monday. I wasn't there. I didn't have to be. My lawyer called me at 11:15. "It's done," she said. I was sitting in a coffee shop on Elgin Street with a latte I hadn't touched. I said, "All of it?" She said, "The account freeze holds. The OSC action is underway, and your husband's name appears on the Alberta registration, which means this is no longer a civil matter." I said, "Okay." She said, "Are you all right?" I thought about that. I thought about Long Beach in the rain, and the fish and chips place, and the way he tucked my hair back on the plane like he was a person who loved me. I thought about 4 years of a marriage I thought was one thing and turned out to be something else layered underneath. I thought about my TFSA and my grandmother's voice telling me, when I was 19 years old, that money you earn yourself is the only money that's really yours. I said, "I will be." The annulment, we had no children, no shared property. The house was mine before the marriage. My lawyer was very efficient, was finalized 6 weeks later. He didn't fight it. He had larger things to fight. The associate pleaded down. My husband is still navigating the process. I don't follow it closely. I check in with my lawyer when there are updates that require my attention, and otherwise I've stopped following the story as if it's mine. I got a text 3 months after everything settled. Unknown number. It said, "I hope it worked out." The flight attendant. I had to sit with that for a minute before I replied. "It did," I wrote back. "Thank you for not minding your own business." She sent a single emoji. A small blue airplane. People ask me sometimes, now that I've told a few close friends, what the hardest part was. They expect me to say the betrayal, or the loneliness of the flight home, or the moment I realized I'd been sharing a bed with someone who was systematically trying to rob me. Those things were hard. But the hardest part was something smaller. It was the 11 minutes on the phone with my bank, listening to hold music, knowing that when the call was over nothing would ever be the same, and I was the one who'd made that happen. Not him. Me. There's a version of that story where I don't open my eyes on the plane. Where I take the sleep I needed, and I wake up to his shoulder and the descent into YVR. And the trip is a trip, and the meeting happens, and I sign something I don't understand, and I lose everything I built quietly, over years, because I trusted a person who had learned to look trustworthy. That version doesn't exist anymore. I used to think being careful was the same as being suspicious. I know now it's not. Careful is just paying attention. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the right person notices you paying attention, at the right moment, from the right angle, and says something before the plane lands. The TFSA is still mine. So is the house. So is the future I was trying to protect without knowing I was protecting it. That's enough.